independence can be considered in some sense founders. And so we need to look at sometimes at the forgotten founders, a wonderful book by an author named Dreisbach, right? So in order to understand the complexity of the spirit of the American founding in 1776, we need to recognize that there were a lot of people who participated in the American founding. Of course, there are then all of the men and women who participated in various ways throughout the Revolutionary War from 1776 to 1783. And then we have the period of the Articles of Confederation, when we were governed under the Articles of Confederation. And that was a very inefficient and ineffective government in many ways. But one of the major achievements of that period was the Northwest Ordinance. And I think that's an often forgotten element of the American founding, but it is one of our founding texts. And the Northwest Ordinance refused to allow slavery to move into the Western territories. And that established a precedent that predated the Constitution, a precedent that the Whigs, a precedent that the Republicans really took their stand on in the Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850. It was a very important document to Abraham Lincoln in thinking about America growing westward without the extension of slavery, growing westward as an empire for liberty fundamentally, and laying the groundwork for a gradual ending of slavery and emancipation of slavery. And then, of course, we have the Constitutional Convention, everyone who was involved in the Constitutional Convention, and then all of those who were in the ratifying conventions of all of the states and those who wrote the state constitutions, because of course, the United States of America has both a federal and a state level. So the American founding is an incredibly complex event. And I think to simplify the spirit of 76 and to simplify it down to just this one point, right? That it failed to immediately eradicate slavery in every state where it was, is to misunderstand the complexity of human history. So within that context, right, of a complex American founding, with a group of American founders, right, I wanted to speak particularly about the Adams family, in order to give the Adams family their due. Now, this is a Adams family project, and has been from the beginning. John Adams was always a little bit jealous of George Washington being the solo pater patriae, the solo father of the fatherland, that he was the one pole star, right, who had been the sword of the revolution as the leader of the Continental Army, that he was our first American president and unanimously reelected president, that he had been the silent presence at the Constitutional Convention, an unusually tall man, a very wealthy man with the largest library in the American colonies, and that he had achieved, George Washington had achieved what no other Southern slaveholding planter had accomplished, which was to free his slaves at his death, giving each of them enough property and an education in order to support themselves. So the Adams family is always very aware that George Washington holds a kind of primacy of place among the founding brothers. He's very much the founding father. He was a kind of ideal of virtue for even the other American founders. So perhaps there's the great three, right? George Washington, and then on either side, the pen of the Revolution, Thomas Jefferson, and then James Madison, who's very much an important architect of the Constitution, right? So where do the Adamses come in, right? To give the Adams family their due in the spirit of 76, and what did they contribute to the idea that 1776 is a moment when America was conceived in liberty? So I tend to think of the Adamses not just in terms of John Adams, the participant in the American founding and our second president, but I think of all of the Addams family, the Addams family through the centuries, which in some sense also helps us to realize that America is an ongoing project, right? Trying to live up to its American founding ideals, right? Which is very much the mentality that the Addams has had with regard to the American founding. So I like to think of the Addamses as America's first political dynasty. There's a wonderful book by Richard Brookhiser called America's First Dynasty about the Addams family. And it gives you John Adams, his son, John Quincy Adams, his son, Charles Francis Adams, and his son, Henry Adams. Right. So John Adams is most important in the American founding as the ambassador to Great Britain, helping to negotiate the treaty at the end of the American Revolutionary War. Right. He is the diplomat of the American founding, right? So if we have George Washington, the general of the American founding, Thomas Jefferson, the pen of the American founding, Madison as the constitutional constructor of the American founding, John Adams is very much the diplomat of the American founding. And his son, John Quincy Adams, also became ambassador to Great Britain, helping to negotiate the Treaty of Ghent at the end of the War of 1812, which was very much viewed by the Adams family as our second war for independence against Great Britain, where we asserted ourselves once again against British naval power in the Atlantic. And he went on to become Secretary of State. His son, John Quincy Adams' son, Charles Francis Adams, also became ambassador to Great Britain under Abraham Lincoln. He was Abraham Lincoln's man in London during the American Civil War, making sure that the British did not come into the Civil War on the side of the cotton-growing, slave-holding South. And then Charles Francis Adams's son was Henry Adams, who became the historian of the family, right? Looking back at John Adams, looking back at John Quincy Adams's time as Secretary of State under Madison and Monroe in his history of that period, looking back at his father, Charles Francis Adams, and his action in the midst of the Civil War, right? And being kind of the historian of the family, looking back, right? Now, I teach Henry Adams, Henry Adams's great memoir, which is in some sense a memoir both of himself and of his family, called The Education of Henry Adams, which is one of the greatest nonfiction works of American literature of the 20th century. And Henry Adams, looking back at the American founding, said that even though all of the other founding brothers of 1776, this constellation of founders is the way he describes it, right? Constellation of stars in the sky. Right? And he says at different times they shift their position in the night sky. And sometimes you admire Thomas Jefferson, and at other times you don't admire Thomas Jefferson. And sometimes you admire Alexander Hamilton, and sometimes you don't admire Alexander Hamilton. Sometimes you admire Benjamin Franklin, and other times you don't admire Benjamin Franklin. These were human beings, right? We don't have a divine founder of the United States of America, right? We don't think it was founded by the gods. It was founded by a pantheon of flawed human beings. Nevertheless, Henry Adams, looking back, continued that great American tradition of particularly expressing admiration for George Washington as the father of his fatherland, the father of his country, because he had somehow managed to get himself out of debt and managed to free his slaves in a way that he thought would give them a dignified life, right? He didn't think that freeing his slaves, George Washington didn't think that freeing his slaves and leaving them destitute, casting them on the public welfare, casting them on the public purse, as they said in the 18th century, was a way of giving them genuine freedom. He thought that was to do things the wrong way, right? To give people political freedom, but not economic freedom. For the American founders, true freedom was founded in having property and having enough property to fulfill your moral obligations to God, Father, and country. If you didn't have enough money to support your family, if you didn't have enough money to tithe to support your church, if you didn't have enough property to be taxed for the public defense, then you weren't really a public man. You weren't really part of the republic, a participant in the freedom of the public, right? And so for them, for the American founders, very much for George Washington, very much for Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, this was very much a Federalist view, was that liberty was grounded in property, right? And that political independence went with economic independence. And so the great concern of John Adams is that America, having gained its political independence through the War of Independence from 1776 to 1783, the main concern of the Federalists, the main concern of George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams was that America needed to repay its war debt. If we did not repay our war debt, then although we had achieved political independence, we would not be economically independent from those European powers who had loaned to us for the purposes of the war. We would be indebted to France. We would be indebted to the Dutch. We would be indebted to Russia. Right? And like so many Latin American countries, which also had revolutions of political independence against Spain, against European powers, unlike so many Latin American countries which failed to repay their war debt, the point of the Constitution for Madison, Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams was to make the United States government powerful enough to achieve economic independence from Great Britain. Now, the biggest problem in terms of economic independence that they saw was that the Southern colonies relied almost exclusively on a cash crop that they had to export and sell to Great Britain. They had been reliant on tobacco. They grew to be dependent on cotton. As they moved into the Southwest in the 19th century, they grew to be dependent on sugar, right? And this is not sustenance farming. You're not growing your own food, right? Man cannot live on tobacco alone. Man cannot live by eating cotton. Man cannot live just on eating sugar. And so these were cash crops. These were export crops. They exported them and then they imported food and they imported manufactures, largely from Great Britain. And so the Southern colonies, because of their dependence on a cash crop slave labor economy, were very vulnerable to being a point of dependence for America on a foreign economy. And so in trying to establish a truly independent country and a truly independent union, the Adams family was committed to diversifying American commerce, diversifying American crops, right? George Washington led the way on Mount Vernon by trying to get out of tobacco, going into wheat farming, starting fisheries on the Potomac, starting to graze cattle, and trying to diversify his crops so that he himself could get out of his debt, right? And therefore make enough money to be able to give the slaves, upon their freedom, enough property that they would not be destitute and would not be cast upon the public purse, right? He was very concerned, even for one of his runaway slaves. It's a very famous story about George Washington that he pursued one of his young slave women who had run away. And you can see that he was concerned that she would be left destitute, which actually is what happened to her in her old age. She was living on the public purse, I believe in Providence, Rhode Island. So this concern, right? This is what I would say the Adams family contributes to the spirit of 1776, this realization that personal independence and national independence, that political independence and economic independence go together, right? That I am not personally free if my country is completely dependent on third world countries, right? I am not personally independent if my country is completely dependent on China, right? That personal independence goes along with national independence. and that political independence goes along with economic independence. That if I have the vote, right? If I've been given the vote and I can participate in public life, but right, I am in massive credit card debt, right? That I'm not really free. I'm not free to change my job. I'm not free to take a different job that I think is more aligned with my political beliefs and my lifestyle, my desire to support my family. So this is the spirit of 76 as we get it from the Adamses, right? Realizing that for America to be free, America needed to free itself from dependence on slave labor and cash crops in the South, right? That this is an American project that we're all involved in, right? The Adamses, moving on to John Quincy Adams, the Adamses were very aware that the North was complicit in slavery as well because of their merchant shipping, because Boston shipping interests had been involved in the slave trade. They had made money on the slave trade, which became capital that they then used, right, in insurance firms to insure the slave trade, or to invest in manufacturing with the cotton mills in New England, which competed with the cotton mills in Great Britain. So the Adamses were very aware, right, that this was a national project, right, that we had to work on together and over the generations, right, to free ourselves from Great Britain, to free ourselves from Great Britain's project of subjugating America through a monopoly on tobacco and tying the American economy during its colonial period to a single cash crop of tobacco, the way that they had tied the Indian economy and the Indian subcontinent to the cash crop of cotton. This would be a great concern of Gandhi in the 20th century, right? And so the Adamses really contributed a vision of the complexity of the prudential judgments that were needed for a nation to do what was right, right? That we as a nation needed to repay our debts, achieve independence, right? Slowly eradicate our addiction to cash crops. We needed to diversify our economy. We needed to build infrastructure. And we needed to find a way to eradicate slavery. John Quincy Adams, towards the end of his career, he's a really extraordinary figure because he was Secretary of State under Madison and Monroe. He was President of the United States of America, just briefly for one term, but then he's the only president who, after his presidency, returned to the Congress. And during his retirement years in the Congress in the 1840s, sort of in the close of his life, as an elder statesman who had lived through the American founding, who was a kind of pivot figure between the founding generation and the period of Jacksonian democracy. John Quincy Adams, in his old age in the 1830s and in the 1840s, was fighting constantly in Congress against the gag rule that made it impossible for petitions against slavery to come before the Congress, right? And this was his adamant fight in his old age, to such an extent that his wife, Louisa Catherine Adams, laments in her diary that John Quincy Adams's fight against slavery is ruining his health. It's ruining his family. It's even ruining his trust in the providence of God, because he's so agonized at the evil of slavery and how ingrained it is increasingly becoming in the American political system, and that he's ruining his career, that he's becoming persona non grata, that he's becoming a political outcast because of his adamance and vehemence on the issue of slavery. And of course, this image of John Quincy Adams, right, the elder statesman, trying to remind America of the ideals of 1776, remind America that in the Declaration of Independence, we had said all men are created equal, that nowhere in the Constitution does the Constitution refer to African Americans as property, right? That the Constitution refers to African American slaves as persons held to servitude, right? It recognizes their personhood. The famous portrait that we have of John Quincy Adams fighting this fight, it's kind of what I would call the Adams family's last stand, right? John Quincy Adams's last stand is his Supreme Court battle in the Amistad case. And there is a wonderful movie about the Amistad case. It's not a perfect movie. It's not perfectly historical. There are many problems with it as a historical film. And yet, I would very much recommend that people watch Anthony Hopkins as John Quincy Adams, an elder statesman, making his case before the United States Supreme Court in favor of the slaves who had mutinied, who had risen up on the slave ship Amistad and sailed that ship into Boston in hopes of gaining their freedom. And he argued that case over a 10-year period, day in, day out, month in, month out, right? As he is giving his final speech, and the movie does give a kind of cameo of John Quincy Adams' final speech in the Amistad case. As he's giving his final speech, right, he's trying to wrap up his case. He is drenched with the sense of the death of the founding generation. Right? His father had died. Thomas Jefferson had died. George Washington had died. Alexander Hamilton had died. The founding generation who had believed in these ideals, who had passed the Northwest Ordinance, who did not want slavery to move into the Western Territory, had died. And whether the Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, and Pierce and Buchanan, who fought the Mexican War in order to bring Texas into the Union as a slave state, right? Whether they were living up to those founding ideals of 1776, right, caused John Quincy Adams deep agony in his old age. As he was trying to conclude his case, each of the Supreme Court justices died. And so they would have to pause the case, wait for the nominations process, wait for the confirmation hearings. Right? There would be another nomination process and another confirmation hearing when the next Supreme Court justice died, right? And he had to wait as the old justices, sometimes justices that his father, John Adams, right, had appointed to the Supreme Court, passed away, right? And new justices were appointed. New justices were appointed by members of the Democratic Party, right? Justices who would reinterpret the Constitution, as meaning that African Americans were property who could be taken out west, right? That the language of property could be applied to slaves. That is a language that is applied during the period of the Jacksonian Democratic Party, right? That is not the spirit of 1776. John Quincy Adams returns to the fight, right? And he uses two phrases in that final speech, right? And this is where I want to end so that then we can have some time for questions. He uses two phrases in that final speech. The phrases don't make it into the movie, which is why I would really encourage you to print out the last page of John Quincy Adams's famous address closing the Amistad case, what was called his grand peroration, right? The grand finale of his speech, because it is actually much more beautiful than the one that is given in the movie, The Amistad. It's a famous speech. that was the most famous abolitionist address throughout the 1840s and 1850s. Before young Americans could memorize the Gettysburg Address, young children of abolitionists were memorizing the grand finale of John Quincy Adams's address in the Amistad case. And two of the phrases that he uses there, right? He calls upon the Supreme Court justices and he says, remember that you too are going to die, that you too are going to be judged by the supreme judge of this world. And you are going to be judged for whether you put into action the words of the American founding, or whether you were unfaithful to the principles of the American founding. He says, I hope that when you die, you will hear from the supreme judge of this world those beautiful words from the gospel, come, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master. If you are faithful to the principles of the American founding, if you are faithful to the doctrine of the Declaration of Independence, which says that all men are equal, if you live up to the idea that slaves are persons held to servitude and that the slave trade should end and that slavery should not move out west, that this should be an empire for liberty, then you will hear those words of approbation at your death. Come, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master. And then he uses another phrase. He uses a phrase in Latin from the great text of Western civilization, Virgil's Aeneid. Right? He uses an amazing phrase, right? He uses a phrase that essentially means, here I rest my case, right? Here I lay down, right, all of my life's efforts before you, right? This is my last battle. I have returned to the court from my retirement for one last battle, right, to defend the freedom of these slaves, right? And he compares himself to the figure of Entellus in Virgil's Aeneid, an old fighter who is challenged by a younger generation, just as the American founders were challenged by the Democratic Party, who wanted to extend slavery to the westward. He compares himself to Entellus, who comes back for one last battle against an upstart fighter. The name Entellus is actually where J.R.R. Tolkien gets the idea of the Ents, the old gnarly trees, right, who are too tired to fight, but find in themselves and in their old sap, right, enough strength for one last battle, coming to the defense, right, of the freedom of Middle Earth against Mordor. Right? And John Quincy Adams also compares himself to Entellus, right, to an old warrior, right, returning for one last battle to defend the spirit of 1776 against the Democratic Party, which wanted to make America an empire for slavery instead of an empire for liberty, as the American founders had intended. Right? And so he closes his speech in the Amistad case, saying, "Hic cestus artemque repono." Here, my belt and my weapons I lay down. There's something very beautiful, very triumphalistic, right? My whole life's work has been at the service of the spirit of 76. And I have closed it in an effort to bring the spirit of 1776 and its opposition into slavery into the next generation, right? His son, Charles Francis Adams, would be Abraham Lincoln's right-hand man in preventing the British with their cotton mills from coming into the Civil War on behalf of the Southern slaveholding planters. And then Henry Adams, right, would become the historian of this great family, right? And so I just really think that Americans, when they're talking about the spirit of 76, need to realize that the Adams family dynasty ought not to be forgotten, right? That their spirit is a light in dark places when all other lights go out. They very much saw themselves as bearers of that torch. They were born in log cabins. Their log cabins are still standing today in Quincy, Massachusetts. They were not born in slave-holding Southern tobacco plantations. They were farmers and shoemakers. They had come off the Mayflower as Puritans, and they insisted that Puritanism taught them that evil is new in every generation and freedom is new in every generation. Every generation needs to fight again for moral principle, that the battle is never completely over, right? But that we fight that battle all together as Americans. They believed in the Union. So make your political pilgrimage to Quincy, Massachusetts, the only place in America where two presidents are buried together in the same resting place beneath the first church in Quincy, Massachusetts. Both John Adams and Abigail Adams, John Quincy Adams and Louisa Catherine Adams are buried there. The fighters for the true spirit of 1776. Thank you, and I would love to take questions.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful speech. And there are questions coming up, and I don't know if you can see them. I'm actually just going to start with one of my own for just looking forward beyond 1865. And when in fact, you're talking about the connection between making America great and making America free. And you made me think about the impulse after World War II, which was connecting, American, standing in the Cold War against Russia with the domestic reform of civil rights. And was there any explicit connection or hearkening back to the Adams heritage in that line of argument of, which helped make the civil rights revolution happen in the 50s and 60s? As I say, as part of, we must make the American Republic greater in the world.
So this might seem like a little bit of an esoteric answer, but yes, indeed, there is a connection. There is a very interesting little intellectual lineage that one can trace between Henry Adams and Martin Luther King Jr. So in Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, which is an incredible text, which all of the students at the University of Dallas have to read. It is a core text in their American Civilization course. And so I've been teaching Martin Luther King for 20 years, having students read his letter from a Birmingham jail, which is an argument in favor of civil disobedience. And he grounds his argument for civil disobedience in the idea of natural law, that laws passed by a legislature, laws passed by a state legislature, laws passed by the federal legislature, any statutory law has to be measured against the laws of nature and nature's God, that they have to be measured against the eternal and moral law. And he says explicitly that he gets this idea from reading those figures of the great Judeo-Christian heritage, which had been enlivened during America's fight against totalitarianism during the American Civil War and the beginnings of the Cold War, right? So the natural law tradition, grounded in the writings of St. Augustine, who Martin Luther King quotes, and in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, who Martin Luther King quotes in the letter from the Birmingham jail, that natural law tradition had been revived in America during the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, because it was seen as the best counter to totalitarianism, whether that totalitarianism was National Socialism, German fascism, or whether it was international socialism, Soviet communism. Socialism, right? The glorification of the state and the belief that states have the right to make any laws that a majority wants, whether that's a racial majority, as in Germany, or a fictitious workers' majority in the Soviet Union. They claimed to be a democratic republic, but they were not. There's the party majority. There was this argument in America, really put forward by figures like Jacques Maritain and Mortimer Adler, but then also, right, so many other figures that Martin Luther King was reading when he was a seminary student at Boston University. When Boston University was a Methodist seminary, he was reading this great natural law tradition. And Henry Adams, what I call, so he's sort of the last of the Addams family dynasty,
Right.
Not denying that there are still Addams family members alive today, right? That dynasty continues. But Henry Adams is the historian looking back, right? Henry Adams in his old age became fascinated with Thomas Aquinas and the natural law tradition. And one of his nephews, one of his nieces married into the Lafarge family. One of his nephews becomes a medieval art historian, and a member of the Lafarge family is actually the famous Reverend John Lafarge, who helps to write the document Humani Generis, which proclaims the unity of the human race. Right, it is the great argument against scientific race theory that says that there were multiple points of beginning to the human race, and that white people are simply better than black people, genetically because of evolution. So the Addams family is actually contributing to a 20th century rejection of race theory and arguing that humans are humans, that we all come from the same stock. So yeah, there's a strange intellectual lineage from Henry Adams to the revival of natural rights theory to Humani Generis and the affirmation of the unity of the human family, right? And Martin Luther King writing his letter from the Birmingham jail. I know that's a little bit of strange intellectual history, but there you have it.
Best sort. Thank you. Well, that was my question. I'm going to speak for the trees. No, I'm going to speak for the audience. Actually, I speak for the ends. Abigail Adams's role. That's a question. In fact, we're talking about the Addams family role in freedom. Can we bring in Abigail Adams into this story?
So, Abigail, I'm actually fascinated with all of the Adams women. Abigail Adams and Louisa Catherine Adams. In some sense, I would say that they are keepers of the flame of Christian faith in the Adams family. There's a new book on the Adams family, which is called Household Gods, by someone whose last name is Giorgini. The household gods of the Adams family, kind of looking at the spiritual life of the Adams family. Right. And one of the important things that the Addams family brings to the American tradition, right, or represents in the American tradition, is this vivid sense of original sin, right? That everyone is flawed, right? That things are not, as the Beatles would have it, getting so much better all the time. It's getting better all the time, right? The Addams family didn't believe things were getting better all the time, right? They believed, as Christians, that every new generation who comes into the world is sinful and free, right? And has to struggle to conquer themselves and to live virtue. And that we cannot solve all of our problems simply with politics, that there needs to be a revival of religious and moral life in order to overcome the evils of our society. And that is a really important picture of how American life has progressed through the ages, right? So we had the Great Awakening, the Great Evangelical Awakening in the 18th century. The Great Evangelical Awakening associated with figures like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, right? And it's through that Great Awakening that abolitionist spirit first arises, right? And people first embrace the abolitionist spirit as they're also embracing a greater sense of their own moral and civic duties. This is what John Adams refers to as the great revolution in the minds and hearts of the people that predated the political and the military revolution. Then in the 19th century, we had the Second Great Awakening, right? Second Great Awakening, very much associated with the Beecher preacher family. Lyman Beecher and his innumerable children, all of his sons also became preachers, all of his daughters also became teachers. Perhaps the most famous is Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote her great abolitionist novel, her great abolitionist tract against slavery, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then in the 20th century, right, that revival of natural law theory is partly coming because of the influx of Jewish and Catholic immigration from the continent, fleeing the rise of fascism in Italy, the rise of fascism in Germany, the rise of fascism in Russia. So we get Russian Jews, we get Poles, we get Italians, we get Southern Germans, right? Anyone who doesn't want to live under a totalitarian regime is flooding into America in an extraordinary migration, which is creating a new religious revival, right? This time, oddly enough, with a lot of Protestant conversions to Catholicism. So many Protestant conversions to Catholicism that Harvard, the old Puritan stronghold of academia, since the Mayflower in 1630, Harvard creates a chair of Catholic studies in the 1850s. So American history, the abolition of slavery has actually followed a revitalization of Christianity in the 18th century, Great Awakening, the revitalization of Christianity in the 19th century, Second Great Awakening, and the revitalization of Christianity in terms of natural law thinking and the Judeo-Christian heritage in the 1950s. You think of great preachers of the 1950s like Billy Graham or Father Sheed, Father Sheen on the television, right? These were the great revivals of the 1950s, right? So making America great again has always really been rooted in faith, and faith has always been at the root of getting rid of our national sin, our national original sin of slavery, right? Being tied to a cash crop and being tied to slave labor. So Christianity has always been the solution. And so groups like Black Lives Matter that want to replace the Black churches and get rid of Black Christianity, the Black Baptist tradition, the Black Methodist tradition, in terms of leadership of the civil rights movement, are rejecting a very powerful tradition in American history of Black Christianity, right? And the gospel hymns of liberation, which are such an important part of American culture.
That's actually leading me to a question I wanted to ask. So, there's the broader idea that the Great Awakening is Puritanism gone wrong, heretical Puritanism. To what extent is Nicole Hannah-Jones a heretical Adamsite? I mean, to what extent is she picking up on anything in the Adams tradition, and is she rejecting stuff in it?
Well, I think that the utopianism, the democratic socialist utopianism of current radicals is very far from the spirit of the Adams family. Another book that I might recommend, I'm sorry, I'm recommending an entire library worth of reading here, but I see that one of the questions is that this understanding of history is now being dismissed as a fabrication. And I know that that's true. And so people need to really put some time into re-educating themselves by reading the right books. And so I would very much encourage reading the books of Russell Kirk, both his Roots of the American Order and The Conservative Mind. And his book, The Conservative Mind, he really treats the Adamses as the backbone of an interesting form of conservatism, right? Conservatism, which is trying to conserve liberty, right? Yeah. Trying to conserve the principles of the American founding, right? But he points out there that Adams was anti-utopian. They fundamentally did not believe that the state is the engine for perfecting human society, right? That has been tried in the 20th century and found terribly wanting, right? But the Adamses, both John Adams observing the political utopianism of the French Revolution and Henry Adams prophetically predicting the political utopianism of the Russian Bolshevik Revolution, right? Predicted that attempts to create a perfect society using the power of the state to create absolute egalitarianism, absolute economic egalitarianism, right, would lead to a form of totalitarianism, the complete destruction of civil liberties, right? This is this is really what the Adamses give us is a skepticism about political utopianism. Right? It is the Adams spirit that gives us George Orwell's 1984, a political dystopia about the future. Right? It is the Adams spirit that gives us Aldous Huxley's Brave New Family, right, as a dystopian futuristic novel. Right? The Adamses were very skeptical about political utopia, right? Very skeptical because they said human nature is flawed, right? You can't build a perfect society with flawed human beings. Every generation will come into the world with a tendency towards evil, a need to struggle to conquer itself, achieve virtue, reach out for the grace of God, and assert its own freedom. But it's not just going to happen once and for all, right? So this political utopianism, right? The idea that once we get rid of the Electoral College, once we have public schooling indoctrination for all with a new K through 12 civics program as mandated by the federal government under Obama, then all will be well and all will be well and all manner of things will be well, right? Because the state will perfect society, right? The Adams family, they're too Puritan to believe in such things, right? And so they're very, very skeptical of such ideas.
So I guess I just want to follow up then on that same question you were looking at. And how practically do you argue, and I guess, as a teacher in the classroom, as a public intellectual in the public square, with people who just, dismiss this, or come in thinking this just isn't true. How do you persuade people of the truth, particularly when they are sort of, dead set not to listen?
Mm-hmm. There's a wonderful phrase in one of my favorite movies, Princess Bride, where one of the characters says, this word, inconceivable, this word, I do not think it means what you think it means. So when you take phrases that people have rattling around in their heads, right, that they've heard before, but they don't know the full meaning of, right? Phrases like the under God phrase, phrases like the laws of nature and nature's God, Phrases like persons held to servitude in the Constitution. And then you show them where they came from, where we got these ideas, right? It helps them to realize that they can't help it. They are Americans. This is their heritage. They have grown up with these ideas. I mean, the idea that you could claim to be a person with dignity and rights, right, and yet reject Western civilization, which gave us the word persona, that gave us the word dignitas, right, that gave us the notion of right, in the sense of jurisdiction, right? That this might be right or wrong, right? But you don't have a right to tell me whether to do it or not. This is an idea that has long roots in the Western tradition, right? Without the Greeks, without the Romans, without Cicero, without Thomas Aquinas and the tradition of canon law, right, we wouldn't have this notion of rights and jurisdictions, the dignity of the person, right to trial by jury, right to habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, a Latin phrase, which means you have a right to your body. I have a right to have my body, right? Not to be arrested without being told what crime I'm being arrested for, right? I need to know what I'm being indicted for. You can't just arrest me and put me in jail and keep me there without telling me what I've been accused of and let me face my accuser, right? Anonymous complaints on a hotline don't cut it, right? These are long American traditions, right, that aren't written in the Constitution. They're not written in any statutory law. They're part of our unwritten laws, which we have gotten from Western civilization. So when a policeman who you think is being brutal is clapping handcuffs on you, and you say, what did I do wrong? What am I doing wrong? What am I being arrested for? What is my crime, right? You are appealing to Western civilization against the police, right? So you need to show people that the ideas that they have, right, by which they think they're challenging the system, are actually coming from Western civilization, are rooted in a long-standing tradition of liberty. The idea of the equality of all human beings, right? God bless the American founders for thinking it was self-evident, right? It was only self-evident to them because out of a 2,000-year tradition, right, they had learned that, right, if Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, then Socrates is mortal. They had learned that, man is made in the image and likeness of God, male and female, he created them. They had lived under the British constitutional and common law system and had come to claim their rights before the law, in the supremacy of law of Magna Carta. When they said it's self-evident that all men are created equal, meaning all human persons, that was self-evident to them as Christians and Britons, right? It is not self-evident to a lot of cultures across the globe, right? If you talk to Hutus and Tutsis in Africa, they do not think that all men are created equal. If you look at the caste system in India, they do not think that all men are created equal, right? The dignity of women in most Islamic countries, the dignity of children in ancient Roman law. They were the property of the father who had the right of life or death over them. It took a long time to develop the idea that all men are created equal. So to mock it, to scoff at it, to diminish it, shows an enormous ignorance of how fragile the achievements of Western civilization are, and that we need to actually put an enormous amount of educational effort into passing this heritage on to the next generation.
Thank you. And I have another question I want to it was burning at me. You were talking about, in fact, the economic context, of what the Adams were doing. And I guess would this be right to say then that the search for political freedom, individual freedom, racial freedom, is sort of it's embedded in a conception of economic freedom, which is in itself embedded in a system of natural law? And I guess this, I think the question is sort of related to: is this at a distance from an Adam Smith conception of economic freedom, or is it, how close is it to that? How different is it?
Mhm. Right. So I like to talk to my students sometimes about the fact that English is a very complex language, because it has both Latin roots and also Germanic roots. We also have some Celtic words, words that come to us from the French. Um, so it's a very complex language, a very strange dialect that we speak. um, and so we have the possibility of speaking both of freedom, and of liberty. And I think that, if people explore, right, go onto the Oxford English Dictionary and explore the centuries long history of the words freedom and the words liberty, you'll discover that this is why we have a very rich understanding of human freedom as an English speaking peoples, right? As Winston Churchill called us, part of the English speaking peoples, right? Um, the What I want to draw attention to particularly is liberty, right? Libertas. Right? Instead of having the sense that, um, you have the freedom to do anything, the freedom to do whatever you want, the freedom to be whatever you want to be, the freedom to transform yourself if you're a transhumanist, right? The freedom to identify as a squirrel if you want to identify as a squirrel. This kind of natureless, right? Natureless, amorphous freedom, right? Um, Libertas, I think, is a much more grounded, sense that you are free to pursue happiness, free to pursue the fulfillment of your human nature. And that means freedom to be just, right? And the highest element of justice, are the great thou shalls, right? Um, Thou shalt honor God, thou shalt honor your country, thou shalt honor your mother and your father, right? The great thou shalls, right? Um, we know thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not commit adultery and thou shalt not kill, right? Even Aristotle, knew that there were such things, right? That are intrinsically evil by their very names, right? And there are such things as absolute moral negatives. Aristotle says in his Nicomachean Ethics. But the focus really of our life should be on trying to use our property, right? Whether that is our talents, our energy, our work, right? Or the physical property that has come to us through using our talents, our energy, and our work, right? And it's a very important idea that when you work on a piece of property, right, when you sow seeds into the land and you farm it and you produce more food on it than would have grown in the wild, right, that you have signed that property with the signature of your work, right, with the signature of your humanity, right, and it has become yours, right? Property simply means proper. It is proper to you, right? It is proper to you to have the fruit of your labor, right? So to use the fruit of your labor to support your own dependents, right? To support your own children, to support your own elderly father and mother, right? To educate your own children, parental rights and education, right? To take care of the elderly, right? Not to have the state decide to euthanize them against your will, right? That it is your liberty, right? It is your right, to take care of your dependents with your property, right? To be taxed to such an extent that you can no longer fulfill that vital part of your moral obligation, which enables you to be just, which enables you to be happy, right, is a destruction of your pursuit of happiness, right? because you are happiest when you can fulfill your most important moral duties. I'm happy when I can care for my children, provide for my family. I'm happy when I can accompany my aged parents, right, with dignity, and celebrate a wonderful funeral for them, right? To use that property to tithe to the church, to support the institutions that I think are doing valuable work in this world, right? Whether they are tax-free churches, whether they are 501c3 philanthropic groups, right? Supporting the arts, supporting education, supporting charitable work, right? That I would have the liberty to use my property, right? To support good works that I think are necessary, right? That I not be taxed to such an extent that I cannot freely support the groups that I think are doing the best work for the common good, right? And lastly, that I would support the public defense, right? That I would be taxed to support the public defense, right? So really, this idea that liberty is for virtue, the most important virtue is justice. The highest element of justice is religious patriotism and family obligation, God, Father, and country, and that we need property to pursue happiness, right? I know there's slippage between Locke's phrase, life, liberty, and property, and the Declaration of Independence's phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? But liberty and the pursuit of happiness do require, because we are bodies and souls, we are not just freestanding souls which can transmigrate into the body of a squirrel or decide to become a cloud, even if it's an iCloud, right? We're bodily creatures. We need material possessions in order to support God, Father, and country. We need to give food to the hungry. We need to pay our soldiers and take care of our veterans. We need to give actual food to our children, right? So property is necessary for liberty, virtue, and the pursuit of happiness.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to say it's now 12:17, which was in fact our original stop time, much as I'd love to keep you on longer. I think what I'll just mention just for later, there was a question, will there be a recommended book list? If by any chance you wanted to provide a recommended book list, which we could then pass on to the NAS, we would be glad to publish and pass that along, since that was, I think, that would be the last great thing. I don't want to cut you off suddenly, but I think we would be coming to the end of our bit here, and I would just say to the listeners, we will be having yet more episodes in the series, our conference, Slavery or Freedom, and that's starting at, I believe that's 2 p.m. today,
If
Eastern.
anyone has any further questions for
Yes.
me, I just want to say that I'm always happy to respond to questions at my professional email, which you can find at the University of Dallas. I teach in the history department. I'm chair of the history department at the University of Dallas, and I'm happy to respond to emails later. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And you can also send emails to randall@nas.org. And as I say, 2 p.m. and that I believe is Paul Ray speaking on our founding ideals. Professor Hanson, thank you again so very much. It's been a wonderful speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.